Hello and welcome to the 2021 Esri Developer Summit. My name is Randall Williams. I'm joined here today with my colleague Jeff Smith, and we are here to discuss one of my very favorite topics with ArcGIS Enterprise, and that's ArcGIS Enterprise security best practices. So to kick us all off, let's start with our agenda here. Our focus is on security best practices for ArcGIS Enterprise. ArcGIS Enterprise for this conversation will include ArcGIS Server, Portal for ArcGIS, and some advanced options for consideration there. We do strongly recommend some knowledge of ArcGIS Server and Portal for ArcGIS, essentially the ArcGIS Enterprise stack, because some of these topics get just a little bit esoteric. But honestly, if you're just joining us for the first time, you'll probably take away some very good stuff from this conversation that we're going to have. So first off, let's take a look at what's considered what's called the defense in depth paradigm, and that's that a security plan has multiple different layers, multiple different levels of security. Whenever you're talking about the system as a whole, each feature that we're discussing here is considered a layer. Think of it like a seven bean dip or something like that you might have enjoyed over the Super Bowl. You can probably do away with one of those layers if it doesn't suit your fancy, if it doesn't work with what you're trying to do. You may want to add some layers into there to make it an 8-layer dip, kind of whatever it is that you're worried about. But you do want to make sure that you have some layers of security so that you have fail safes behind some of these different options, some of the more standard options that we have here. So again, just think about this graphic with the number of locks in the door. The more locks may or may not make it more secure. It's more things to have to get through, and that's what you're going to see in kind of a bastion or a castle type of thing, where you have multiple layers of security, including the gates and the moats and the archers up top and maybe some infantrymen running around, that kind of thing. So we're interested in creating a more secure environment by layering on different options and again taking some of these options into your use case, because they may not necessarily fit within your particular environment there, but there are things that you need to be aware of in this consideration. So. For a quick review here, let's talk about the ArcGIS Enterprise, the on-premises solution for ArcGIS. It's a simple, well-integrated and open type of system here, where we're connecting ArcGIS desktop and web applications and mobile devices together with your portal. Your portal's kind of the front-end presentation piece for the ArcGIS Enterprise, which includes your ArcGIS server on the back end, as well as your content and services that you're providing out to everyone else. ArcGIS Enterprise includes 3 different primary components. Those are Portal for ArcGIS, ArcGIS Server, and the ArcGIS Data Store. And that's what's considered to be your base enterprise deployment. Now, you may end up deploying additional ArcGIS servers to suit your needs, to suit different licensing roles, and you may end up having additional RDBMS systems. Maybe you've got an Oracle system or a SQL Server system in addition to your ArcGIS data store that you're working with in your environment there. And one thing that we don't mention here, but is actually also core to the defense in depth and to ArcGIS Enterprise in general, and that's the web tier, where your web adapter might be installed, or where your network load balancer or reverse proxy, or however it is that you might be exposing your ArcGIS Enterprise system out to the internet. We won't be talking too terribly much about the web tier during the course of this discussion today, but just understand that that's a key part of the architecture as well. So first and foremost, the very best thing and the very first thing that you can do with ArcGIS Enterprise, ArcGIS Server, ArcGIS Data Store is the patch updates, the check for updates or patch notification tool that we have. That ships with each ArcGIS Enterprise product, and you can run it, just one of those, and it will pick up all of the different patches that are available for the software that's installed on your machine. So you can go through and install all of the patches, or just install the security patches. We do recommend that folks, as soon as you deploy ArcGIS Enterprise, go ahead and install those patches and keep an eye out for additional security patches and regular patches that are available. A pro tip, if you go out to trust.arcgis.com, that's the ArcGIS Trust Center, there's an RSS feed that you can subscribe to. Every single time that we release a patch for ArcGIS Enterprise, we blog about it. So you can read that blog. You can understand the impact of these various security issues that occur, and you can make the determination as to whether or not to install those fixes and how quickly you need to go ahead and deploy those patches, because we provide some level of understanding of relative risk and call to action based upon the severity of the issues that are being fixed in the patch. So with that in mind, let's jump into our agenda. We are going to start with ArcGIS Server, where we're going to talk about a little bit about HTTPS. We used to harp about that a good bit during the course of these discussions, but now that ArcGIS Enterprise ships with HTTPS enabled and required by default with plaintext HTTP disabled, while we don't mean to de-emphasize that, we don't need to go into that as deeply. We'll talk about disabling the services directory and why we recommend doing that. We'll discuss cross-domain requests in the context of ArcGIS Server. That's CORS type stuff. We'll talk about the hows and whys of disabling the PSA. That's the primary site administrator account with ArcGIS Enterprise. And we'll talk about serverscan.py. That's a script that you can use to scan ArcGIS Server and check to see if your ArcGIS Server is conforming to the best practices that we've laid out in our documentation and during the course of the slides. Later on in the course of this discussion, we'll talk about Portal for ArcGIS, and we'll also discuss some advanced options that are available in ArcGIS Server, or in ArcGIS Portal as well. So without further ado, let's jump in here. So a lot of the options that we're going to be talking about today involve working with the ArcGIS Server Admin API, or the Server Administrator Directory. As you can see in the URL there, that's HTTP localhost if you're directly in front of your GIS server or whatever your GIS server host may be. And that runs on port 6443, that's our default application server port, /ArcGIS/admin. And what that does is that provides an interface into the ArcGIS Server site, and a lot of security settings can be enabled via this interface. Now, this interface also maps directly to ArcGIS Server Manager. So many of these options that you see here, you might actually also see in ArcGIS Server Manager, because in the backend, ArcGIS Server Manager is basically sending queries to these resources. But it's just important to know that we have this administrator directory. You can perform some scripting against it if that's what you're interested in doing there. But just understand that a good many of these options that we'll be discussing here are accessible through the ArcGIS Server Admin API. So the first thing that we want to discuss, enable and use HTTPS. As I just mentioned a few seconds ago, HTTPS only is enabled by default in ArcGIS Enterprise. What is new in ArcGIS Server 10.9 and ArcGIS Enterprise 10.9 is that we've added support for the TLS 1.3 protocol. So by default, what you'll see is in this update security configuration setting is the protocols TLS 1.2 and TLS 1.3. And so this should always be one of the first things that we do with ArcGIS Enterprise, is understanding that we need to encrypt that traffic using HTTPS. So what HTTPS does is it basically creates an encapsulated tunnel between the client application and the server application, and that helps to protect against a simple network sniffer. And the reason why that helps to protect against a network sniffer is because those network sniffers themselves require what's called a certificate, and a server certificate provides you with a sense of non-repudiation and a sense of you are who you say you are, and that's backed up by a what's called a certificate authority that basically has money in the game that to validate that that the information that you're sending from point A to point B is can't be modified with it or viewed within the context of someone placing a man-in-the-middle proxy on your network there. So again, this is a great option. It's the first option that you should check on to enable, and we hope to see the future when the entire internet uses HTTPS for all websites instead of just most of the websites that are available out there. Again, starting at 10.7 by default, ArcGIS Enterprise is HTTPS only. If you have a specific use case that requires it, you can disable the HTTPS only requirement. There may be some use case that's associated with that. Sometimes you might see like a college environment where you're not interested in paying for certificates. These days, with free certificates providers like Let's Encrypt, that's an excuse that's no longer really valid so much. So we do frown on people disabling HTTPS only, but we also understand that security, like many of the options in ArcGIS Enterprise, is basically there to help you tailor your environment to your users and to your use case, because it is possible to secure an environment to the point to where it's not usable for your users, and that kind of defeats the purpose of security there. So that's enough of that kind of disclaimer as far as that goes. Now, there is a technology that we will discuss later on. So we will just be discussing these SSL cipher suites. We'll be talking about the SSL protocols. And we'll be talking about a technology called HSTS. That's HTTP Strict Transport Security. We'll talk about those in the advanced options topic. But a lot of folks are interested in enabling HSTS whenever they configure HTTPS. So while HTTPS is configured by default, HSTS is not. That's one that you need to opt into, and we'll discuss why a little bit later on. These are all configured in the ArcGIS Server admin directory. Again, you just go into the home, click on the security button, and then into config, and then update, and then you can change these settings as you see fit. Next, let's talk about an easy win with ArcGIS Enterprise. That's disabling the ArcGIS Services directory here. So the services directory is a development tool that's not really intended to be enabled on production sites, but it does make it easier for people to navigate through your services and issue simple queries and understand what kind of services that you have available to be consumed. So there's no real functional impact to disabling the ArcGIS server directory other than not being able to browse through your services easily, but it does help prevent Google bots from going through and finding your items there, and it does in some cases it could potentially help with reducing potential cross-site scripting issues that we might not have caught. Those are fewer and fewer. Those are found fewer and fewer times in the software as the software is improved over time. We've done a focused effort on eliminating cross-site scripting issues in the ArcGIS services directory there. But again, it does kind of help to prevent the layman from poking around in your services and doing things like that. And so it works by essentially disabling the HTML view of the services directory. But your web applications and your clients, they all speak to ArcGIS Server in JSON, so they don't really consume the HTTP interface here. So that's how there's no functional impact to working with ArcGIS Server, because you're not disabling JSON responses. You're just making it that much more difficult to for Google bots or for people that you don't expect to be working with your services to do so. And again, when we're talking about things like that, these are layers of security. There are certainly use cases where folks, the intention is to be able to widely share and disseminate geographic information with ArcGIS Server, and they want to keep their services directory open to the public so that the public can browse it and consume their services and the applications that they want to work with. That's a use case that we certainly respect there. So just keep in mind that that when you're making changes like this, that this is a recommendation, but again, your use of this recommendation really depends upon your specific use case here. When you do disable the services directory, you can see in the before and after screenshots here. Before the services directory is listed, and after there's a note that says the services directory has been disabled. How do you go about disabling that? Well, again, you go into the ArcGIS Server Admin API, go into Home, System, Handlers, REST, and under REST you'll find a services directory option there. You can edit that, and there's a checkbox that you simply remove in order to disable the services directory and limit the exposure of your services there. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague Jeff. Jeff Smith is a product engineer on the ArcGIS Enterprise team, and he's going to discuss some options, including cores and other options that we have in ArcGIS Server.
Thanks, Randall. I want to talk a little bit about CORS requests. In JavaScript applications, a common method used to retrieve resources from a separate domain or web server is called a CORS request. CORS is short for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. I have a diagram here to try to help outline what a CORS request looks like. The purple box is an end user's web browser. This end user wants to view a web map hosted on their portal, which is the green box in this diagram. Information about this web map is transmitted in a large JSON string, and part of that JSON string includes URLs for the base map and map service layers. The web browser is responsible for making the requests to these individual layers. Now, assuming these layers are not hosted on the same machine as the portal, each of these requests is considered a CORS request. Down at the network level, an easy way to identify a CORS request is to look for an origin header in the request headers. When a browser makes a CORS request to a different resource, it adds the origin header to indicate what server this request originated from. In this diagram, the origin header matches the portal hostname. In the response, the browser expects to see an access control allow origin response header. The presence of this response header indicates the CORS request is allowed and the browser continues reading the data. If the response header is missing, the browser will return an error in the console and not read the data. This is exactly how ArcGIS Server restricts CORS requests. I'll say that again. The presence or absence of the access control allow origin header determines if a CORS request is allowed or not. In ArcGIS Server, the list of allowed origins is maintained in the Administrator Directory API under System, Handlers, REST, Services Directory. By default, the allowed origins property is set to star, or wildcard, indicating ArcGIS Server will accept all CORS requests. To restrict the CORS request to unique origins, each of those origins needs to be listed in the allowed origins property. Wildcards cannot be used. In other words, if you want to allow multiple origins from the mydomain.com domain, each must be listed. You cannot use a star.mydomain.com. Now keep in mind, this does not restrict overall access to the web services. This only impacts CORS requests, so think of this as another layer of protection. Also keep in mind that it is very easy for security scanners to identify if CORS requests are restricted or not, so it's important to update the list of allowed origins, if at all possible. Let me give you a short demo. So here I'm logged into the ArcGIS Server Administrator Directory. I've already drilled down to System, Handlers, REST, Services Directory, and under the allowed origins, I've specified two domains, the arcgis.com domain and the portal.mydomain.com. Now what you may have already noticed is for this arcgis.com domain, I've only specified HTTP, not HTTPS. That's so we can demonstrate here what happens when CORS requests are being blocked or restricted. So now let's jump over to the next tab. This is my REST services directory, and within here I've got a feature service published, a Colorado feature service with editing capabilities already enabled. I want to view this in the ArcGIS Online Map Viewer. So on the third tab, that's what I've got open here. Notice in the URL I'm accessing this via HTTPS, and over on the right-hand side, I'm capturing the network traffic, and I'm only going to filter the requests going to my webgistesting.net domain, so we can see what happens here. So let's add the layer. Click Add. A couple things to notice right up. First, we get the pop-up right here, indicating that editing capabilities have been disabled on this layer. That's because the map viewer attempted to make a CORS request to this feature service. And we know the origin from HTTPS, www.arcgis.com, was not listed in our allowed origins. If we look at the network traffic, we can confirm that. Down here in the request headers, here is our origin that we just specified, or that we just said. And in the response headers, there is no access control allow origin response header. So Map Viewer recognizes CORS requests are not supported for this feature service, and editing has been removed from this Map Viewer. The CORS requests are needed in order to make edits on this feature service. Now, the other thing worth noting here is even though CORS was restricted, we can still view the service. In fact, we can still click on this and query individual components within this feature service. That's because to display the feature service or to query features within the feature service, CORS requests are not needed for that. Other types of requests are used for that. But now, let's go back to our services directory. Edit this. Let's change this back, or change this to HTTPS now. Click Save. The changes will take effect immediately. And if we jump back to our ArcGIS Online Map Viewer, create a new map. Let's clear this out. And now I'm going to add the same URL, the Colorado Feature Service. This time it adds, notice no pop-up. We have the edit button right here, so editing is enabled for this feature service. And if we look at the network traffic, the first request to the REST info, down here, just like last time, we've got an origin header. But this time in the response headers, we see an access control allow origin and access control allow credentials. This tells Map Viewer that CORS is fully supported on this feature service, and that's why it knows it can safely enable the editing capabilities for this feature service. Now I'll pass this back over to Randall.
Hey, thanks for that explanation and demo, Jeff. So the next option that we have is disabling the primary site administrator account. We do recommend disabling the primary site administrator account. That helps to remove the default method of administrating ArcGIS Server, and we would suggest enabling Windows users and roles with ArcGIS Server, and then promoting one of those Windows users to your PSA account. That's similar to potentially removing a default administrator in a standalone Windows machine and then administering it using a domain account when you add that machine to a domain there. So that helps to ensure accountability because your administrator accounts are managed at the domain level, and that way, if an administrator of your ArcGIS Server environment leaves your organization, then managing that account can easily be handled at the domain level rather than someone worrying about or remembering to disable or change the password of the PSA account after that individual leaves. In this case, you go into the ArcGIS Server Admin API or the administrator directory, go into security, and then click on the PSA button and simply click the disable button to disable that option. It is possible to re-enable the primary site administrator account. There's a tool that ships with ArcGIS Server. It's called it's a password reset.bat, and you can run that tool with the -E option. E stands for enable, and you can enable this account in order to perform administrative functions that you need to do under the primary site administrator account if needed. But that's sort of an opt-in option where you kind of configure that as you need to actually use it, as opposed to it always being enabled there. Next, let's discuss serverscan.py. Serverscan.py is a tool that we can use to scan the GIS server for security checks. It's a very powerful tool that can go through and iterate through your various security settings and describe various best practices and whether or not those items are enabled or not. At 10.9, 15 different settings are checked. What it does whenever you run serverscan.py, and again that's in the tools folder in your ArcGIS server installation, is it generates an HTML report that makes recommendations to improve security, and in that report you'll see links to the documentation for it. It categorizes its findings based upon the severity, whether it's critical, important, or just recommended, and it's compatible with both Python 2.7 and 3.x. So here's an example of this report. As you can see, it highlights critical, important, and recommended items that you might want to look into to be addressed. The scan results provide a summary of the issue and also provides a link to more information for the help documents. More information on the script can be found by going to enterprise.arcgis.com and searching for the term serverscan.py. That's all one word. A handy hint that I like to hand out whenever I'm discussing these security scan reports is that the output is configurable whenever you run the tool. So a thing that I like to do is configure a scheduled task to run this tool from a batch file and configure the output to point to a web server that I maintain. That way, these HTML files can be viewed via a browser from anyone rather than having to access the server locally or open an HTML file in a file browser. All right, let's move forward. We've covered ArcGIS server topics. Now let's talk about Portal for ArcGIS. In this conversation, we'll be speaking about briefly about feature layer security. Again, we'll rehash enforcing HTTPS communication only briefly. We'll talk about a feature that's new at 10.9. It's very important, and that's multi-factor authentication. We'll talk about how to disable the sharing API or the ArcGIS portal directory. We'll talk about how to restrict the proxies. That's a very important conversation. We'll talk about CORS requests and how to restrict those, trusted servers, and the scan portal script. Then after that, we'll discuss some advanced options. So jumping right in, let's talk about feature layer security and editing. Whenever you're working with feature layers, editing is a crucial aspect of it, but this functionality is frequently misunderstood and misconfigured and can potentially result in the public editing your items when you don't intend for the public to edit your items there. Typically, whenever we talk about working with editing projects, we tend to try to secure those items, but there are definitely use cases where you might want to have an unsecured hosted feature layer. In those cases, just understand that when you have an unsecured feature layer with editing enabled, that the public can and will go in there and potentially make up false, misleading, defamatory, or inappropriate information and place it into your feature data set. So editing, whenever you have editing enabled and the public is able to access that, it makes it critical important to have some governance around your editing in terms of reviewing that kind of content and doing some QA QC on what you're working with. And feature layer views can help with that. So who can always edit? The owner of the hosted feature service can always edit, or the owner of the feature layer. Administrators will always be able to edit a feature layer, an editable feature layer, and members of groups that have the update capability will always be able to edit a feature layer. And remember that when you do enable editing, anyone who can access the service can perform editing. That's why I mentioned earlier that securing that service might be appropriate for depending upon your use case. Editing is configurable. There are some options where you can allow everyone to add, update, and delete features, only update feature attributes, only add new features, and tasks like that. So this kind of helps you to scope what types of information can be edited and what types of information you might not want to allow to edit. Next, we're going to briefly discuss enabling HTTPS communication. Again, by default, for a couple of releases now, the portal needs to be accessed through HTTPS only. That can be disabled if your use case requires it, but we don't really need to cover that too much since we discussed it earlier on during the course of the ArcGIS server conversation here. Multi-factor authentication is a new option at 10.9. Administrators can enable the option to allow members to choose whether or not to set up multi-factor authentication for their built-in accounts. There are some requirements there. First off, it does require you to have 2 administrator accounts already configured in case you get a new phone or you're locked out of your system for some reason or another because you can't provide a response to the multi-factor authentication prompt there. You also need to have email configured. Email configuration is new at ArcGIS Enterprise 10.8.1, and that email configuration is so if you are unable to access the portal for whatever reason, that the portal can send an email to the administrators of your portal to get you reset up again for that. Multi-factor authentication is strongly encouraged. Multi-factor authentication is the number one way to prevent unauthorized access to any sort of web-based application, whether it's your bank account or Facebook or ArcGIS Enterprise. Multi-factor authentication also helps you achieve the concept of non-repudiation, and that's where a person is who they claim to be and not someone else. And that's a problem whenever folks share accounts or pass out their account information to someone else, because then if there's some sort of inappropriate modification that's been made to your portal, there's no way to reliably track that back to the person who did it. So multi-factor authentication also helps to improve the concept of non-repudiation. Moving forward here, we do have the ability, just like in ArcGIS Server, to disable the sharing API. The sharing API is a browsable HTML-based representation of all the portal items, services, web maps, content, settings, all that kind of stuff. We do recommend disabling this to reduce the chance that your items can be browsed, found in a web search, or queried through HTML forms. It prevents Googlebots from querying through and trolling through your portal, and so it helps to increase security in that respect. Just like an ArcGIS server, Portal for ArcGIS talks to your client applications in JSON format there. The process for disabling the portal directory, which you want to do in a production environment, is very similar to working in ArcGIS Server. The difference is that instead of a checkbox, it's a Boolean value there. So what you would do is go into the Admin API and make this change. You can see the before and after references for what the portal directory looks like after you've disabled the sharing directory there. And again, it's you go in to access the portal admin directory. You go to Home, Security Configuration, and then update the security configuration and set the Disable Services directory value there from false to true, and that will disable the sharing API and make it only visible in JSON format there. Let's talk about a very important concept in ArcGIS Enterprise. I'm going to go a little bit slower during the course of this slide because I want to make sure that everyone understands what this property is, what it's for, and why we should be restricting machines of accessible by the portal proxy. So Portal ships with a built-in proxy server that's used in some scenarios to access resources on different machines. For instance, that proxy is used for storing credentials for secured services coming from another ArcGIS server, maybe for accessing premium services online that require a username and password. It's used sometimes for adding OGC services to your content and accessing services from systems that do not have CORS enabled. By default, that proxy is open because we cannot proactively know from where you're going to be consuming these resources from. And so what a proxy does essentially is act as a forwarder for requests. So a request is sent from a proxy, and the proxy receives that response, and then the proxy itself makes the request back to another machine. So it looks like the proxy is the one that's making the machine. And this way, for instance, that's how we obfuscate credentials from being sent over the network in the case where you add a secured service to portal and you save the username and password along with the portal item there. However, an open proxy can impact the installation there because it could potentially cause a type of attack called an SSRF, a server-side reflected forgery, which basically means that you can send a crafted request potentially to the proxy, and then the machine that is being proxied to sees the request as coming from that proxy rather than from the person who initiated the request. So that could potentially, if there's information that's known about the inside network there, the victim machine that's inside of the network on the right-hand side of the firewall in this graphic might believe that that request is coming from Portal for ArcGIS. And so it's important for us to set parameters for the proxy to restrict its capabilities so that it's unable to forward resources to hosts that you don't specifically define there. So we do this again in the security configuration for Portal for ArcGIS, where we open up the Portal Administrator directory and set the allowed proxy host parameter there. If you note in this example, you can use wildcards with the allowed proxy host parameter using the expression there with the open parentheses dot star close parentheses star with the domain at the end, and that will help to limit the resources that can be proxied to your to other resources and help to prevent potential SSRF attacks. At this point, I'm going to hand the presentation over back to Jeff, where he's going to go over some additional options in Portal for ArcGIS and provide us with a couple of additional demos.
Thanks, Randall. We talked previously about CORS requests for ArcGIS Server. CORS requests are also used in Portal for ArcGIS to access specific resources. Instead of the resources being map services or feature services, the resources here are typically items like web maps. An example might be a web app builder app that is downloaded and hosted on a separate web server. When the web app is accessed by a web browser, the browser needs to make a CORS request to retrieve the web map JSON string that resides on Portal. The CORS request and response headers are identical to what we discussed for ArcGIS Server, where you need the origin header and the access control allow origin response header. We've covered incoming CORS requests in both ArcGIS Server and Portal for ArcGIS, but there's one more variation I'd like to discuss. This is an outbound CORS request with credentials. That happens when a portal, web map, or app is the origin, and the CORS request is going to a service endpoint secured with web tier authentication, like Integrated Windows Authentication, or IWA. When a user directly accesses a map service endpoint configured with IWA, the authentication happens automatically without having to input credentials. This is seamless and creates the single sign-on experience. Now, when a CORS request is made to this same endpoint, a special header needs to be included in the request to handle the authentication. If this authentication header is not included, the request will fail. Since this is an asynchronous request, there is no option for the browser to ask the end user to enter credentials. To accommodate this, Portal uses a list of trusted servers to identify specific servers where this authentication header should be included with these CORS requests. For security reasons, Portal does not try to include this header for all outbound CORS requests. It is limited to this list of trusted servers. Here is a screenshot showing where you would add the list of trusted servers. This can be accessed by logging in as an administrator and going to Organization, Settings, Security. Here I've got one domain listed under the trusted servers. This means any portal, web map, or app that needs to make a CORS request to an endpoint on this domain will include the IWA authentication header in the request to handle the authentication. Also on this page is where we define the list of allowed origins for incoming CORS requests. By default, as we said before, by default, Portal accepts all incoming CORS requests. But once one or more origins are added to this list, Portal will only accept incoming CORS requests from those origins. Another security option that is on this same page deals with whether members can share content publicly. This applies to both your members' profiles and to the content they own or have published. If you're an administrator for a portal that is only exposed to your organization internally on your local intranet, then it is probably fine to allow this. If your portal is exposed to the entire internet, then you may want to consider disabling this option to prevent your users from accidentally sharing sensitive content with everyone. There is not a recommended setting for this though, since it is very dependent upon your environment. Now, similar to the ArcGIS server security checks, we also have a Python script that inspects your portal and generates an HTML report with recommendations. There are 12 different security settings that are scanned, and they are divided up into 3 different categories based on the severity: critical, important, and recommended. Here's an example of a scan report. Notice each finding has a description in the scan results column, along with a help link that you can click on to get information about how to change that setting. You can also get more information on all of the items scanned by going to enterprise.arcgis.com and searching for portalscan.py. Now bear in mind that this report is based on our assessment of the security settings. There could certainly be scenarios where one or more of these findings cannot be changed in your environment. That's fine. My recommendation, though, would be to run this scan at regular intervals so you can easily identify security changes that have been made. Now we are moving on to some advanced topics that we'd like to discuss that apply to both Portal for ArcGIS and ArcGIS Server. First off, let's talk about group managed service accounts. Starting in 10.8, we added the ability to configure Portal, Server, and Data Store on Windows to run under a group managed service account. These accounts are treated like domain accounts, but with restrictions. They can only be used in a few places, including the logon as accounts for Windows services. The little $sign at the end of the account name is used to indicate that it is a group managed service account. So what are the benefits of using a group managed service account? The key one in my mind is you don't have to worry about an expired password. The password is 128 characters and is managed internally. It gets changed automatically every 30 days by default, but nothing needs to be updated inside the Windows services or reconfigured. It all happens behind the scenes. The other benefits are that there is no interactive logon and the account is restricted to a predefined set of computers. This makes it a very secure account that is difficult, if not impossible, to compromise. There are 2 places where you can select to use a group managed service account. One is during a new installation, and the other is when you're using the Reconfigure Service Account tool. As you see in the screenshot here, once you indicate it is a managed service account, you do not have to enter a password for it. Keep in mind that the service account cannot be changed during an upgrade. For upgrades, the existing service account must be maintained throughout that process. It can certainly be changed, though, afterwards. Another thing to remember is that this group managed service account can only be used right now as a Windows service account. This means you cannot use the same account to communicate with your Active Directory identity store inside the Portal for ArcGIS or ArcGIS Server configuration settings. We have received requests to allow the managed service account to be specified here, but at this time we don't support it. Now I'll pass this back to Randall to discuss some of the TLS protocol configurations.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. So now we're going to continue on with SSL protocol configurations. So since ArcGIS 10.4, both server and portal can be configured to limit which SSL or TLS protocols are accepted. In 10.9, we've introduced support for TLS 1.3 so that new installations of ArcGIS Server enable both TLS 1.2 and TLS 1.3 by default. This only impacts the communication with Portal, ArcGIS Server, and ArcGIS Data Store over the internal application server ports 7443, 6443, and 2443 respectively. Protocols used by the web server that hosts the web adapter, or for your load balancer or your reverse proxy, or whatever you use in front of ArcGIS Server, must themselves be configured separately. Users that are working with IIS on the front end understand that TLS 1.3 is not yet supported in IIS, so you won't be necessarily taking advantage of TLS 1.3 from the web tier in this respect if you're working with IIS. Moving forward in our conversation about SSL protocols and cipher suites, these are configurable. You can go into the Portal Administrator directory or the ArcGIS Server Administrator directory, either in Security SSL certificates for Portal or Security Config for ArcGIS Server. And you can change the SSL protocols and the web server cipher suites that are supported in your ArcGIS Server configuration per your specific organization requirements. There are a couple of caveats whenever it comes to updating these settings here for ArcGIS Enterprise. For instance, you may want to validate that your clients themselves support the protocols and cipher suites that you're working with. Occasionally, I've seen older GPS receivers, for example, not supporting TLS 1.2, and when users move to deprecate older versions of TLS with ArcGIS Enterprise, then they have at times caused themselves a denial of service condition between those clients because those clients cannot themselves connect to and talk to ArcGIS Server. So if you need to, you can add additional ciphers, remove ciphers, add older protocols if you prefer. These are the defaults that we support in ArcGIS Enterprise, or remove them as needed. But just understand that sometimes with reverse proxy configurations and things like that, that your usage of these cipher suites and of these SSL protocols are predicated on whether or not the client on the front end is actually going to support those items there. It's also important to note that HSTS is also configured here for ArcGIS Server and ArcGIS Enterprise. And again, HSTS helps prevent a type of attack called an SSL preload attack, where it forces your browser to always communicate with a resource over HTTPS, regardless of how the address was typed into the address bar. It kind of forces that communication again over HTTPS to prevent that preload attack. All right, we're going to close out here with this last slide regarding security findings. If your organization performs any kind of security auditing or security scans and you get back results that you'd like to have some interpretation on, you can always reach us via https://trust.arcgis.com and make use of that report a security concern form. You can report issues related to software vulnerabilities found in ArcGIS Online or in ArcGIS Enterprise or any of our other applications that Esri provides. You can report suspicious emails that you think comes from Esri. Maybe if you were targeted from a phishing attack or something like that, we can validate those issues. Privacy issues. If you have a privacy concern related to ArcGIS Online or Esri as an organization, occasionally we do have customers placing content on ArcGIS Online that may be considered protected content, and you can inform us of those types of issues, and we can take various actions from our end. We have policies and procedures in place to help deal with that, or any other security, privacy, or compliance related concerns with Esri or our products. You're welcome to report this to us via trust.arcgis.com.